When I take on a new student, the most common questions I get are, how do I make my son or daughter read more regularly? And how do I become a more confident reader myself? In this video, I'm going to tell you what I always tell them. So here we go. Practical tips to get you into reading and form a regular reading habit. My first piece of advice to students when they're looking to just get into read is finding something that interests them. So the first thing I ask the student to do is list any topics they're into. And if they can't think of any topics, they list the things they do with their time. Do they play computer games? What movies do they watch? What TV shows do they like? And pretty soon you can start to see one thing coming through, which is genre or type of book. So let's say a student likes action things, SAS Who Dares Wins on Channel 4. I'm probably going to recommend to them reading Ant Middleton. His books, First Man In and The Fear Bubble, and he's got a new one about to come out, Mind Over Muscle. More than once I've had a student who's into action and adventure, and Alex Rider isn't doing it for them anymore, and so they've kind of stopped reading. And so I get them to read the first 2 pages of The Killing Floor by Lee Child. It's the first Jack Reacher book, and usually, even just after those 2 pages, they didn't realize that was exactly what they were looking for. And before you know it, they're reading every day. A lot of the problems, however, are when students try to read a book and they give up after 10 or 20 pages because they just feel overwhelmed, they can't keep up. Actually accessing reading and the process of reading is just too hard and they're not used to it. A good tip that always worked for me is to find a movie or a TV show you like and then read the book that it's based off of. By doing this, you already know the world and the story and the characters. So a lot of that heavy lifting that your brain has to do when it's taking on a new story is already done for you. So instead, you get to focus on the details, the writing. You're not constantly trying to understand what is happening. You can actually take in the words. And then you can focus on the things like the deviations that the film adaptation made, the little characters who are in the book that weren't in the film, the detours that it took. And this helps your brain to be open to new information while reading words on the page. And this strategy can also work when you're a more confident reader. So for example, for me, I tried to read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's a difficult book to read. It's not long, but the language is so dense and it's from a very particular character point of view. So then I decided to watch the movie. And then I watched the movie, and even though the book is very different from the movie, I understood who the characters were, I understood the setting, I understood the underlying story, and it allowed me to access that very specific dialogue, that very specific prose style, and I was able to read the book and love it. So as you become more confident, you can try this trick with even more difficult books. My next tip is, when you're starting out, choose short books. You may be tempted by that big lovely book and think this is the one that you're going to power through, but pretty soon, if you're not used to reading, when you hit 40, 50 pages, maybe even 100 pages, you're going to slow and you're going to get demoralized and you're going to give up. Instead, if you start with a short book and you actually get through it, the thrill of accomplishment for actually reading a book will propel you on to reading the next book. And then maybe that one can be a little bit longer and a little bit more challenging. Good short novels you may want to try. Neil Gaiman's Coraline, I can't recommend that highly enough. Or you might want to try something like Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist, one of the best-selling books of all time. And then, again, as you become confident reading those shorter books, you may want to try a more challenging shorter book. One of my favorite books that I recommend to students all the time is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I do not suggest you start with this book. It's short, but it's dense, but it's also incredibly rewarding. My next tip to get into a regular reading habit is read early in the morning. Don't leave your reading until later in the day when you're tired. Make it part of your morning routine and start with small goals. Maybe just start with 2 pages a day, and then after a couple of days, crank it up to 3 or 4 pages a day. It really does help set your mindset up in the right way to attack your day. My next tip is the popular technique of habit bunching. Habit bunching is where you couple something new, like reading your book, with something that you do every day. Could be making your cup of coffee in the morning, your book sitting right next to where you brew your coffee. And before you know it, you're having your coffee as you're reading your book. And the two become inextricably linked. It could be exercise. You read straight after you've exercised. You make a cup of tea, you sit, you read. My next piece of advice is try not to sit too comfortably when you read. If you sit comfortably like I sometimes do across an armchair or on the sofa, your mind ends up drifting, and before you know it, you've been reading for 20-30 minutes and you've only got through 2 pages and you can't even remember those 2 pages. So what I do now is I tend to sit in the kitchen. I sit on a wooden chair that's not entirely comfortable. It's not uncomfortable, but it certainly isn't making me want to fall asleep or daydream. And that way it helps focus my attention on the page. So for those 10 or 20 minutes, I'm really taking in what I'm reading. Another tip to keep you engrossed in a book is highlight things as you go. I often highlight books. It's especially if it's non-fiction. This one here, my problem is I tend to highlight too much really. But what this does is it keeps you thinking about the book. And then every couple of days you can look back over your notes before you start reading, and it gets your mindset plugged back into the book. And if you write something down, let's say you could use your a notes app on your phone, you could use a piece of free software like Notion. It's a fantastic software online. I suggest you just Google Notion, it will come up. And by keeping these little notes, people who write things down are twice as likely to remember it. And the whole point of us reading here is not to try and read 100 books in a year. You're going to see loads of videos where they're saying, I read 100 books in a year, I read 300 books in a year, I read a book every day for a year or every day for a month. But when you do that, you're shallow reading, you're skim reading, you're not retaining any information. What you and I are trying to do is we want to read deep. We want to read to be fully engaged in a story or to learn new things and use the information that we learn. And a really good way is on something like Notion or even a notes app on your phone or even in a notebook. Just write down a few bullet points at the end of every day's reading. It helps you process what you've just read up and can help you access the book again much more easily when you come to read the next day. And at the end of the book, you've always got those notes that will just jog your memory about what the story was about, the characters, or if it's a non-fiction book, the information that you need the information that you gained from that book is all right there in front of you. And trust me, even after 6 months, a year, when you flick back through those bullet point notes, the whole book is just going to come back to you. And what you've done there is you've retained the information on that book. You haven't just read on a surface level just so that you can say you've read 30 books in a month. Another tip that's linked to this is never move past a word you don't understand. Write new words in those notes at the end of each reading session. What it will do is it will make you become more confident with vocabulary. And these things make you become not just a more confident reader, but a more confident writer and a more confident speaker, a more confident arguer. Let's imagine you just learned 2 new words a week. At the end of the year, you've learned around 100 words. In the end of 5 years, you've learned an extra 500 words. And trust me, with an extra 500 words in your vocabulary, you're going to have more words at your disposal than most of the people you know. Another tip to keep you focused on your reading is avoid YouTube videos, magazine articles, Twitter. The problem with things like this YouTube video, it's kind of ironic that I'm saying this to you to not watch YouTube as we're on a YouTube video, but YouTube videos tend to be anywhere from 30 seconds to around 20 minutes long. But either way, they are short form. They probably average 5 to 10 minutes. Short form content, especially on Instagram or Twitter, it trains your brain to be addicted to that quick fix of information and then move on. It's creating a very short attention span. I'll challenge you. What did you read yesterday on Instagram or Twitter that you can remember now that affected your life in any way? Probably nothing, right? But if you'd read a book, if you'd done these reading practices and you'd read for 20 to 30 minutes every day and you were regularly reading and you were keeping notes on what you're reading, the chances are some of that has gone in. You've taken that information inside, you've ingested it, and it's going to help you be a better person, a more understanding person, a person who has taste, a person who knows what they like and what they don't like, a person who is more well-rounded, a person who's more interesting. You want depth and nutrition for your mind, not snacks. So there are two other sort of physical and mental barriers that a lot of people have that prevents them from getting into reading. The first is called saccadic eye movement. A saccade is like the natural movement of the eye, which is to dart around. It's jumping around all the time in these quick little movements called saccades. And what happens when we read is our eye struggles to stay in a smooth reading pattern. It's jumping up and down, it's jumping left and right. We end up having to read back over the bit we've just read. As a result, many of us struggle to focus while we're reading. In contrast, when we're actually fixated on something that is moving at a steady pace, like let's say a car that's passing us, then we're able to have that very smooth eye movement. And that's what we want when we're reading. And a little, very simple tip for this is just take a pen or your finger, and as you read your book, move the pen under the line that you're reading. And although your eyesight will be fixated on the actual words above the pen, you'll be naturally following the flow of the pen underneath. So you'll have nice, smooth movement. There's a real trick to this though, in order for it to work properly and stop saccadic movement. And that is to move the pen just slightly faster than you think you're comfortable with. It forces your eye to keep moving forward and trains your eye and your brain to take in the information quicker. It not only makes you a more confident reader, it will make you a faster reader too. And the other thing that used to plague me all the time and really prevents a lot of my students being confident readers is what we call subvocalisation. This may be you, where you're quite a slow reader, because as you read you can literally hear your own voice in your head reading those words aloud. And what's happening here is you're actually trying too hard to read. You're trying too hard not to mess it up. It's like when you were in English class at school and the teacher asks you to read out the book, and you're so petrified about stumbling over the words. All your concentration is about not stumbling over the words. So you don't actually take any of the information in. So there are a few ways to try and interrupt that pattern. And what you've actually got to do is take a little bit of your attention away from what you're reading, believe it or not. Because when we have subvocalisation, it's because we're trying too hard to read. We're forcing it. So the first way sounds a bit weird, and you'll see this one recommended on other internet videos as well, is to chew gum. When you chew chewing gum, you're actually taking a little bit of attention away from what you're reading to chew the gum. Maybe like a few % of your attention is going on here, but that's enough just to stop you trying to force what you're reading into your brain. It's like a tiny little distraction. And a similar one to this that I always used to use when I was younger, and still occasionally use today, is to listen to music while you read. Generally, it can't be something that has words in it because that's going to take your attention away. But if it's something that is, piano music, or one that I love is lo-fi hip-hop, really works for me, or film music is something that I always used. I used to listen to the Star Wars soundtracks and things like that when I was young, doing my work or doing my reading, because it just took that little bit of attention away from where I'm reading, where I'm focusing on it so hard it's just not going in my brain, and I read a whole paragraph and realize that I haven't learned anything and I need to reread it. By taking that 5% of attention away, suddenly it's like opening the floodgates a little bit. It just allows the information to go in. And then the final one, which I still use today, is it's not one I've ever seen online or recommended, but it works for me, and that is literally pacing the room. If you're able to, just pace the room while you're reading your book. And again, the physical act of walking while you are reading takes that information, it breaks that barrier that you have to letting the information come into your brain. It stops the subvocalisation, it stops you reading aloud in your head because you're using your legs and you're walking around. And by doing this, you'll be surprised at how fast you can read a page of your book. Okay, that's it for this video. If you heard anything that you liked here, please hit that like and subscribe button and leave me a comment below.